The rain started just before dark, and Corporal Eden Voss decided that was about right for how the week had gone. He was sitting under the collapsed arch of what had once been a transit relay station, one of 100 structures in the outer district of Varathkessen that had taken varying degrees of damage when the atmospheric shielding failed 3 weeks ago. The shielding was back up now, patched by the infrastructure teams who'd been working through the district in rotating shifts, but the relay station was still a ruin, and the repair crew schedule for this plaza was, according to the last route report he'd filed, approximately 6 weeks out. The composite arch above him had cracked down the center, and the rain was coming through in 2 places. He'd put his kit bag over the worst of the 2 gaps. It helped a little. He was supposed to be at the forward staging post on the northern edge of the outer district by now. He knew that. The patrol route was clear enough. He'd walked it enough times in his 18 months of posting on Varathkessen that he could have done it in the dark, which tonight was an academic consideration, because the dark was exactly what he had. The road that cut through the relay station plaza was the most direct line between his current position and the post, but the bridge over the Kessen Lower Canal had been flagged as structurally unsound 2 days ago pending inspection, and the detour around it added 40 minutes in good weather. In this rain, on the uneven rubble tracks that passed for accessible roads in the outer district's reconstruction zone, it added closer to an hour. He'd timed the detour on a clear day last week, and he'd slipped twice on surfaces that looked solid and weren't, which was the kind of information he included in route reports even when he suspected no one read them particularly carefully. He'd made the call to shelter until the worst of the rain passed. Command would want an accounting. He'd give them one. Standing on a compromised road surface in a city still finishing its emergency stabilization, in full dark, in a downpour, was not responsible judgment for a single-man patrol, and he'd been a soldier long enough to know that the line between acceptable risk and unnecessary one was most clearly visible in hindsight, after the thing went wrong. He preferred to locate that line before the event. He'd also been a soldier long enough to know that waiting out weather in a ruin at night was not entirely comfortable, and that discomfort was generally the correct price for sensible decisions. He was 40 minutes into waiting when he heard the sound. It was very small, that was the first thing. A planet like Varathkessen had its own ambient noise, the low-processed resonance of the atmospheric regulation systems, the distant traffic of transit sleds running even in poor weather on the elevated routes that weren't flood-prone, the particular quality the rain made as it struck the composite paving of the plaza in varying registers depending on the angle and speed. He'd been listening to all of it for 40 minutes. Underneath it, he heard something that didn't belong to any of those categories. It was thin and high and intermittent, cut off almost as soon as it started, and it was coming from somewhere to his left, deeper inside the ruin. Voss got up and went to look. The relay station's interior had been a long rectangular space, a passenger waiting hall, according to the district infrastructure maps he'd been issued on arrival, which he'd read more carefully than most because he was the kind of person who read things carefully rather than the kind who assumed things would be fine. The ceiling was partially collapsed at the far end, where the rain was getting in worst, but the near end was mostly intact under the original arch framework. The Varathi architectural style in the outer districts favored pale composite materials and long horizontal windows at chest height, most of which were now shattered or missing entirely, their frames empty against the dark outside. The hall had the quality of abandoned public spaces everywhere, a scatter of broken seating fixtures, a few route display panels still mounted on the walls with their information frozen at the moment the power had cut, 3 weeks ago, in the middle of the storm. The station had been evacuating. The last route map showed the northern residential lines all running to emergency capacity. He moved through the hall with his shoulder lamp dialed to low, enough to see by without blinding anything that might be frightened by a sudden bright light, which he had already decided was a distinct possibility. The sound had stopped while he walked, but the direction was clear enough. He passed through the main hall and turned at the far arch into the secondary waiting area, a smaller room, lower ceiling intact, still holding most of its original seating arrangement, though one bench had toppled and been left where it fell. The space smelled of rain and old composite material, and something faintly medicinal that was characteristic of the Varathi public building materials he'd been briefed on, a passive antimicrobial in the composite. He'd never stopped noticing it. She was wedged into the corner behind the toppled bench. She was small, extremely small, and curled with her knees drawn up and her head pressed against the wall in the particular geometry of a child who has found the most defensible corner available and is committed to it. She was wearing a garment that had once been some kind of high-quality formal wear, pale silver blue, now soaked and dirtied well past the point where the original color was fully readable. She had white hair, silvery pale, matted to her face and neck by the rain, and her skin was the ash gray of Varathi children before the bioluminescence developed. Something he'd learned in his second month from the settlement orientation materials he'd read thoroughly, that Varathi children under a certain developmental age didn't yet carry the light their parents did, that in darkness or in wet they looked like small pale stones, still and quiet and easy to miss. He hadn't missed her. He filed that away as well. Her eyes, when she opened them and saw his lamp, were enormous and a very deep violet. The sound she made was the sound he'd heard across the hall, thin, involuntary, immediately controlled. She pressed harder into the corner. Her breathing was rapid and shallow and visible. She was soaked through, shivering at a rate that suggested she'd been in this condition for some time, and she had a scrape across the back of her right hand that had bled, dried, and was now tracking fine dark lines toward her wrist that needed attention. She was watching him with the complete, focused attention of a small creature that had not yet decided what he was. "Hey," he said. He kept his voice at the register he used with the stray cats that colonized every military post he'd ever been assigned to, low, even without urgency. "It's all right. You're all right." She didn't move. Her eyes stayed on him. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. He crouched down, bringing himself below her sightline, and set the shoulder lamp on the floor facing upward, ambient light, no beam in her face. Then he sat back on his heels. "I'm just sheltering from the rain, the same as you." She looked at the lamp, back at him, at the lamp again. This circuit happened twice. "Where are your people?" he asked. She didn't answer. That wasn't necessarily significant. Lots of Varathi children below a certain developmental stage had no trade common at all, operating entirely in the formal Varathi their households used, and he had roughly 40 words of formal Varathi and could manage simple structures if he kept them to the vocabulary he drilled in the first month of posting. He'd need to know her approximate age to calibrate whether communication was going to be possible at all, and she was small enough that he was working with significant uncertainty on that front. Varathi developmental timelines didn't map cleanly to human years. The briefing had said 7 to 10 human years, covered a wide and visually ambiguous range. She looked about 6 or 7, maybe a compressed 8. He held the ambiguity. "Okay," he said. "You don't have to tell me, we can just sit here." He settled himself on the floor with his back against the opposite wall and opened his pack. He had 3-day rations, a thermal layer he hadn't put on yet, a secondary signal device on civilian band, and a medkit. He thought about the medkit and the hand and the dried blood tracking toward her wrist, and he thought, in order calmly, one thing at a time. He unfolded the thermal layer. It was designed for an adult human body in field conditions, which meant it was approximately 3 times her size. He folded it in half lengthwise, then in half again, making it into a rough, dense bundle, and slid it across the floor so it stopped about a foot from her corner. She stared at it for a long moment. Then, very slowly, the deliberateness of a decision rather than an impulse, She reached out with one small ash-gray hand and touched it. "It's warm," he said. "Just thermal fabric, nothing complicated." She pulled it toward her. She considered it. She wrapped it around herself, pulling it up around her chin, and the shivering didn't stop immediately, but it lessened to a degree that was visible within the first few minutes. He let out a breath he hadn't entirely realized. He was holding and reached for his ration kit. He didn't try to make her talk. He had learned this early in his career, on a posting that had nothing to do with alien children and everything to do with what happened when civilians were caught in the wrong place when things went wrong. Children in that condition didn't need prompting. They had already been through whatever had produced the condition. They had already done more than their share of the work. What they needed was the absence of pressure, a steady thing that didn't change and didn't demand and didn't add another weight to the ones they were already carrying. The single most useful thing an adult could do, in his experience, was be present and uncomplicated and wait. So he ate his ration, flat, dense, somewhat tasteless, the standard formula, and he kept the lamp on ambient low, and he listened to the rain on the composite outside and the particular quiet of the ruin around them, the settling noises of damaged structures in wet weather that he'd learned in the first month to sort from the noises that required attention. These were fine. The arch was holding. The secondary room ceiling was solid. They were dry, relatively, and they were out of the wind. After about 10 minutes, she crawled out from behind the toppled bench. She didn't come close, not immediately. She settled against the wall about 2 feet to his left, close enough that she wasn't alone, far enough that she'd chosen the distance herself, and pulled the thermal layer tighter, and watched him with those large violet eyes that seemed to take in everything with equal, unhurried attention. He offered her a ration block. She looked at it with profound suspicion. The expression was so complete and unguarded that he might have smiled in other circumstances. He broke off a piece of his own and ate it, demonstrating that it was, at minimum, not immediately lethal, and then held out the rest of hers again. She took it, brought it close, and smelled it carefully. Then she ate it in small, methodical bites, with the focused attention she seemed to bring to everything. He gave her the second block when she finished. "Hungry?" he said, not as criticism. She looked at him, chewing. "That's fine," he said. "I have enough." He did, technically. It was going to make the next 2 days slightly less comfortable than planned, but he'd eaten short rations before, and it wasn't a hardship. The scrape on her hand was still bothering him. He could see it clearly now in the lamp's ambient light, surface damage, nothing deep, clean edges. But it had been open long enough to track dried blood down toward her wrist, and in a ruin in this kind of weather with this much ambient moisture, surface wounds that weren't sealed became a concern over time. He opened the medkit and set it on the floor equidistant between them. Let her look at it. He pointed to each item and named it in the closest trade common approximation, though he didn't expect that to mean much. What mattered was the demonstration. He touched nothing, moved nothing, gave her time to register what was there. Then he pointed to his own hand, mimed a scrape, pointed to the kit, and made a cleaning gesture. She watched all of this without moving. Then she looked at her hand. She held it out. He worked slowly and deliberately, naming each action before he did it. The cleanser first, he held it up, touched a drop to his own arm so she could see what it was, and then applied it to the scrape. It stung. He'd warned her it would. She made a very small sound, barely audible, and didn't pull away. The gauze, the sealing patch. He smoothed the edges carefully and checked the adhesion, and then he sat back and let her look. She turned her hand over and studied the patch with the same total attention she'd given the ration block, the thermal layer, the medkit. An inventory of things assessed. Then she said something. 2 words, formal verathi, spoken precisely, tal veris. He had to work through the phonology he'd memorized before he placed them. Thank you. The formal form, which was interesting on its own, because children her apparent age didn't typically default to formal register unless it was what they'd grown up around. He filed that alongside the quality of the dress, the formal language, the material of the garment, which even dirtied and rain-soaked was clearly something expensive. "You're welcome," he said. They sat in silence after that, and the silence was a different quality from the silence of an hour before, settled rather than held, the difference between a pause and a rest. The rain moved through its registers outside, and the lamp held its soft ambient light, and the ruin was quiet. She leaned very gradually toward the wall. Then, by degrees so slow they were barely degrees at all, she leaned toward him. He didn't move, kept his breathing even. The distance closed in increments of her choosing, and he made no movement that could have been read as directing it. She was asleep against his side before the lamp's next automated dimming cycle, curled with the thermal layer pulled up around her ears. One small ash-gray hand wrapped around the cuff of his jacket with the particular grip of a child who has decided to trust something and is doing it with full commitment. Voss looked at the cracked arch above them, the rain finding its way through the gaps in the ceiling at the far end of the hall, the city outside in the long, patient work of rebuilding itself one section at a time, and thought about what he was going to report to command in the morning. He thought whoever she belongs to is looking for her, that was certain. A child this small in this kind of dress, alone in a ruin in the outer district at nightfall, not a street child, not a child with no one to miss her. She had come from somewhere. She had people who knew she was missing. He hoped they were looking. He hoped they found her fast. He didn't move. He stayed still for a long time after she fell asleep, not by any particular decision, but because moving seemed like the wrong thing to do. The floor was hard and his pack made a poor cushion, and his shoulder was already going to have opinions about this in the morning, and none of that registered as important relative to the fact of the child sleeping against him with her hand around his jacket cuff. He had been in a lot of situations in 18 months on this posting. He'd been in a lot of situations across 12 years of uniform. This was new. He took an accounting, the way he always did during long still watches. The external first, the arch above stable, the ceiling at the far end still letting rain in at the two gaps but the near end dry, the lamp on its dimming cycle, adequate through the night on its current charge, the child's breathing, regular and deep enough to indicate genuine sleep rather than the shallow, fragile sleep of an animal still half alert. Then the internal, the shoulder would be manageable. The back would be louder but also manageable. He'd slept in worse positions on worse floors, and his body knew what to do with it. Then the less quantifiable accounting, the dress, the language. The particular quality of her attention, which was not the quality of a child who'd grown up without structure and supervision. It was the quality of a child who'd grown up with a great deal of both, and who was applying them now, in an emergency, because they were what she had. Someone had taught her, somewhere, to stay still and assess before she committed. Someone had taught her the formal register as her first language. Someone had pressed the precise folding of things and the correct handling of them into her, until it was reflex. The civil liaison, office involvement. He turned that over carefully and set it back down. It didn't change anything about the night. Whatever she was also a cold and frightened child who was now warm and asleep, and that was the material fact. He listened to the rain slowing and thought about the bridge and thought about the staging post and thought, eventually, about nothing in particular. The particular emptiness of a long still watch after midnight where the situation is stable and the work is simply to remain. The rain was slowing. He could hear it in the quality of the sound, the same kind of information reading that you picked up in any outdoor posting if you paid attention to things, which he did. It would stop within the hour. He could make the staging post before first watch change if he moved once she was safely settled, but settled meant awake and settled, not removed from an armful of traumatized child in the middle of the night and deposited back against a cold wall. He stayed. He woke twice. The first time, she was muttering in her sleep formal Varathi, too fast and too low for him to follow, and he simply kept his breathing even and his position still until the muttering stopped and she went quiet again. The second time, the rain had stopped entirely, and the relay station was full of the cold, particular silence of ruins at roughly 3 in the morning, when the night had hit its lowest temperature and everything was still. She was still against him, breathing slow and even. The ash gray of her small face was peaceful in the dimmed lamp light. He checked the time, 4 hours to first light. He opened his secondary signal device one-handed and sent a location ping on the emergency civilian channel for the outer district, flagged * child found, safe, requesting civil liaison contact, secondary waiting hall, old transit relay station, 12th Plaza. He included his garrison ID code. Then he closed the device and put it in his breast pocket where he could feel the notification against his chest if a reply came in. He went back to waiting. She woke just before dawn. He knew the moment she did. Her breathing sharpened and then stopped entirely for 2 full counts while she took in where she was and reconstructed the situation from the evidence available. Then she turned her head and looked at him. He looked back. The sharp edge of the previous night was gone from her face. What remained was the same quality of careful, measuring attention that had been there from the beginning, but steadier now, less edge in it. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the thermal layer and the medkit, assessing what a thing was, determining what to make of it. "Good morning," he said. "Keth Varys," she said. Then she sat up, disentangled herself from the thermal layer with a composure that was slightly remarkable in a child who had been asleep against a stranger in a ruin, and folded the thermal layer. She did it carefully and with evident method, the precise rectangle of someone who had been taught to do things in a certain way, and was doing them that way now, in a ruined transit station in the outer district at dawn, because that was how they were done. He watched her fold it. "You don't have to do that," he said. She looked at him with an expression that said, clearly, that she was aware of that, and that the thermal layer was nonetheless now folded into a precise rectangle, and that these two facts were not in conflict. "Okay," he said, "that works too." She pointed to his ration kit. He gave her breakfast. The response to his signal ping came 47 minutes after first light. It was a garrison notice on the civilian emergency channel, citing an ongoing search operation for a missing Varathi child, female, approximately 7 standard years, missing since the previous afternoon when a transit sled malfunction had separated her from her escort in the outer district. The notice was from the garrison's civil liaison office, which was not a flag he'd seen on child search communications before. The civil liaison office handled coordination between the garrison and the Varathi district administration at an institutional level. It was not in the normal chain for individual emergency responses. He read the notice twice. Then he sent a reply confirming his location and the child's current condition: safe, dry, minor hand injury cleaned and sealed, eating, appears well. The reply came back in under 5 minutes, which was fast for the civil liaison office at any hour and very fast for this hour. It was not from the civil liaison office. It was from the civil liaison office's senior commanding officer, Colonel Thessamarit, who was not routinely involved in child search responses, and her message read, "Hold position. Do not attempt to move the child. Escort is in transit, arrival within the hour. Do not respond to any press contact if approached. Marit." Voss read that message several times. Then he looked at the child, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor across from him, eating her second ration block with focused precision, the folded thermal layer beside her. He thought about the formal dress, the quality of it even wrecked, the formal Varathi spoken correctly, the civil liaison office's direct involvement, Colonel Merritt sending a personal message, the instruction about press contact, the instruction to hold position. Hold position, Do not move the child." "Okay," he said, mostly to himself. She looked up. "Nothing," he said. "We're just going to wait here a bit longer." She considered this. Then *Keth Soul, he worked through the phonology. "How long?" "Less than an hour," he said. She nodded, the Varathi tilt that meant acknowledgement rather than agreement, and went back to the ration block. He watched her eat and thought, "Are you important?" He didn't ask it. It felt like the wrong question in either direction. Either it would frighten her, or it would make her feel like her importance was the relevant variable, when the relevant variable was that she was a child in a ruin who'd needed shelter and gotten it, and he'd have made the same call if she'd been anyone. She paused in her eating and looked at him. "What?" he said. She pointed to the secondary signal device. "I sent a message," he said. "People are coming to get you." She looked at the device for a moment longer. Then she went back to the ration block. He heard the escort before he saw it. The particular sound of transit sleds running on high-priority protocols, the tonal shift in the drive systems, the absence of deceleration variants that indicated route clearance had been called, was something he'd heard twice in 18 months, both times in situations that warranted it. It was a sound that meant someone had decided that normal traffic considerations did not apply. The plaza outside filled with the sound of them arriving, and then with voices, formal Varathi, clipped and organized, the sound of a search operation moving into its resolution phase. Voss got to his feet and the child got to her feet beside him, and she didn't hide behind him, but she moved close enough that his arm was between her and the arch, and he noted that and said nothing, just stayed where he was. The figure that came through the arch first was not a soldier. She was tall of the Varathi deep court bloodlines, which ran several inches above the frontier district median, and she was wearing something that was technically practical clothing, but had started its life as formal court attire and had not entirely made the transition. The silver blue of it was the same family of color as the child's dress. Her white silver hair was long and down, loosely, in a collapse that suggested whatever formal arrangement it had been in had not survived an extended search operation through a city in post-storm conditions. Her skin was ash silver, luminescent in the early light now coming through the broken ceiling, and her eyes were a deep violet so dark they were almost black. She stopped in the arch. She looked at the child. The child made a sound. It was not the thin, frightened sound from the night before. It was not the careful, measured Varathi she'd offered since. It was something entirely different and much smaller, the involuntary sound of a composure losing its footing, and she crossed the floor at a run. The woman came down on her knees in the ruins of the secondary waiting area of the 12th Plaza relay station, and she caught her daughter. She held her with the particular quality of someone who has been afraid for a long time and has just been given permission to stop being afraid. Her hands, long-fingered, ash silver, the same geometry as the child's, moved over her daughter's hair and her face and the bandaged hand. She was speaking in formal Varathi, too fast and too low for Voss to follow more than scattered words, but the register was unmistakable across any language divide. A name, repeated and safe asterisk and here, and something that in the phonological framework he'd been given translated approximately as "I have you now. I have you." Voss stood by the far wall and let it happen. The 6 honor guards who'd entered behind her positioned themselves in a perimeter around the room and arranged their attention toward nothing in particular, the practiced professional not seeing of people who were very good at their jobs. After a time that he didn't measure, the woman looked up. She looked at him the way the child had looked at him the night before, complete, unhurried, taking everything in. Her face was still, and her eyes were bright in the particular way of someone who has been crying and has stopped and is not going to start again. She looked at him for a long moment, this soldier standing against a wall in her daughter's ruin with an empty medkit on the floor and 2 days' worth of ration wrappers, and he had the sense of being read accurately and in full. She said something. One of the guards stepped forward quietly and translated for Voss. "Her Majesty thanks you. She asks your name, soldier." Voss processed * Her Majesty in the same way he'd processed the Civil Liaison Office notice and Colonel Merritt's message, with the particular quality of attention that was different from surprise, because he'd been assembling the picture for the last hour. It landed as confirmation rather than revelation. "Corporal Eden Voss," he said. "Garrison 3rd Rotation, Outer District Patrol, ma'am." He added the last word on instinct, which was probably not the correct protocol for addressing the Queen of Varath Kessin, but he'd never been briefed on that protocol, and instinct was what he had. The Queen spoke again. The guard translated. "Her Majesty asks what happened to the princess's hand." "Scrape," Voss said. "Surface only, nothing deep. I cleaned and sealed it last night. The medkit is there if you want to have it checked." One of the other guards moved to the medkit and examined it, speaking quietly. The Queen listened, and then looked at Voss for a moment with an expression he couldn't read in its specifics but recognized in its broad shape. A recalibration, something taken in and repositioned. She spoke again. The guard translated after a slight pause. "Her Majesty asks if her daughter gave you any trouble during the night." Voss looked at the princess, who had not moved from the circle of her mother's arms, but who was now watching him with an expression of considerable interest. "None," he said. The princess, at that, made the Varathi tilt of acknowledgement. "She was very well behaved," he said. "She folded my thermal cloth." The guard translated. The Queen looked at her daughter. The princess said something that produced a short, low sound from her mother, that Voss took a moment to identify as a laugh. The guard did not translate that exchange. The Queen had been awake since the 3rd hour of the afternoon. The transit sled malfunction had been reported to her at the 4th hour. A mechanical failure on the Outer District elevated route, escort separation. The princess's last confirmed location, the transit hub at the 9th Plaza before the power interruption, had taken the tracking feeds offline. By the 5th hour, the Civil Liaison Office had been activated, the garrison notified, and the Outer District search grid divided between Palace Guard units and garrison patrol teams. By the 7th hour, 1 hour after dark, 1 hour after the rain began, they had covered 11 of the 16 search sectors in the grid and found nothing. She had remained in the Civil Liaison Office command post because it was the most useful place to be, and because being in the command post meant she was receiving information rather than generating the need for it, and because she was the Queen of Varath Kessin and her daughter was missing in the Outer District in a storm, and she had learned, across 12 years of rule, and before that across 15 years of being her own mother's heir, that the most useful thing in a crisis was not action taken for its own sake, but action taken because it was correct. Her mother had taught her that. Her mother had also taught her that the two things were not always easy to distinguish when you were frightened, and that the discipline required to sit with the distinction, rather than collapsing it, was the kind of discipline that cost something. It cost something. She sat with the search grid report at the 7th hour, and at the 8th hour, and she answered the liaison officer's questions accurately, and she thought about her daughter's particular habit of stillness, the quality that had surprised every tutor who'd expected a 7-year-old to be restless, and had instead encountered one who could sit in a window seat for an hour watching the Outer District and be genuinely occupied, and she tried to locate that quality on the search grid. Where would she go? What would she do? Not panicking, not running, finding the most defensible thing available and staying in it. She would find shelter, the Queen thought. She would stay still. She would stay quiet. She had told the search teams, look in structures, look in covered places. She had been told the transit relay stations in the Outer District were partially intact. She had put them on the secondary search list for the second wave. She had been waiting for the second wave's report when the garrison signal came in. One line: child found safe, secondary waiting hall, old transit relay station, 12th Plaza. She had looked at it for one full breath. Then she had said to the liaison officer, 2 words: convoy now. And the civil liaison office had produced the convoy in 11 minutes, which was a record she suspected would not be exceeded. She had not slept. She had not eaten since the midday formal meal, which felt like a previous era. She was aware of both of these things and was setting them aside for later. She came through the arch of the relay station, secondary waiting hall, and she looked at her daughter, and the cost of the discipline she'd been maintaining for 11 hours came due all at once. They had him wait in the outer plaza, while the escort coordinated the convoy for departure. A junior guard officer came out and took a formal report: route, location of the ping, timeline, the child's condition on discovery, in the efficient manner of someone who was going to generate multiple documents from it before it stopped moving. Voss gave it accurately and completely. He sat on a section of ruined wall afterward, in the early morning light that was turning the outer district's composite surfaces from gray to pale gold, and thought about Colonel Merritt, and about the bridge, and about the staging post, and about the filing he had ahead of him. He heard footsteps and looked up. The Queen was crossing the plaza toward him. Without the escort. They were still at the sleds, and she had left them, and she was walking toward him with the precise, unhurried movement of someone who determines their own direction. She stopped a few feet from him, and he moved to stand, and she made a small gesture, the flat palm downward motion that he knew meant *stay or *don't*, and he stayed. She looked at him for a moment. Then she sat on the ruined wall beside him, which was not something he had anticipated, and which the honor guards at the edge of the plaza registered with the complete professional neutrality of people who were very busy examining the architecture. She was quiet for a moment. The outer district was waking up around them. The first transit sleds on the elevated routes, the infrastructure crews gathering at the next plaza over, the particular morning quality of a city doing its slow work. She spoke, he caught. "Daughter, night alone you stayed." "Yes," he said. "She needed shelter, I had it, it wasn't complicated." She spoke again. "Hand careful, how?" "The hand was surface damage," he said. "Scrapes that aren't sealed can be a problem overnight in wet conditions. It was the sensible thing." Another pause. Then she said, in trade common, accented but clearly deliberate, she had it. She'd been choosing not to use it in the formal exchange inside, where the protocol apparently required the translator. She was alone for many hours before you found her. "I don't know exactly how long," he said. "She was cold when I found her, she was frightened, she managed it well." She did not call out. No, she was quiet. She'd found the most defensible corner she could, and she stayed in it. He paused. That was good judgment. In that situation, quiet is right. The Queen was still for a moment. Who taught her that? He didn't know if it was a question. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe no one taught her. Maybe she worked it out." She looked at the wall they were sitting on. Then at the relay station behind them. Then at the sky, which was pale and clear above the outer district's broken roof lines, the first real clear morning in 3 weeks. "She said," the Queen said, "that you sat across the room, that you did not move toward her." "That's right. She said you gave her the warm cloth first. She was cold, that was the first thing. She said you ate the ration first yourself." A pause, to show her. "Yes." She noticed that. He didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what there was to say about it. It had been the obvious approach, not a calculated one. The Queen looked at him. "Not everyone," she said, "thinks to show rather than tell." He looked at the outer district, the crews in the next plaza, The rubble cleared lines where the repair work had made progress and the places where it hadn't yet. She was frightened, he said. Telling frightened things doesn't help. You have to show them there's something steady. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you have done this before. Yes, he said. Other context, different world. A pause. Children are generally the same. Varathi children, she said, are told that humans are unpredictable. The briefing materials are old. He considered that. The briefing materials for humans about Varathi are also old, he said. I've been here 18 months, and I've had to correct mine a fair amount. She made the short sound again that he'd identified as laughter. They sat in silence for a little while longer in the early morning light, and it was a comfortable silence in the way that silences are sometimes comfortable between people who are not trying to fill them. Thank you, she said finally, Corporal Eden Voss. She's all right, he said. That's the important part. Yes. She looked at the wall they were sitting on, the pale composite, the crack running through it from the atmospheric impact 3 weeks ago. But not everyone who could have found her would have stayed, would have sat across the room. He thought about that. I don't know what other people would have done, he said. I know what seemed right. Yes, she said. That is what she said also. She said he knew what was right. He looked at her. She was looking at the outer district, the long work of it, the morning light on the reconstruction. She is 7, the Queen said. She is not wrong often. The convoy left 20 minutes later. He watched it go from the plaza, the primary transport with its tinted windows, the escort vehicles, the organized departure of something important being safely returned. The primary transport's passenger window came down 2 inches as it moved through the far end of the plaza. A small ash-gray hand appeared, opened, and closed once. Then the window went back up and the convoy moved on. He watched it out of sight. Then he picked up his kit, flagged the relay station on his route report for the urgent inspection list. The arch gap he'd sheltered under was letting through significantly more water than the initial damage assessment had apparently indicated, and walked to the staging post. The debrief with Colonel Merritt took 2 hours and 15 minutes. She asked precise questions in a precise order, and he answered them precisely, which was the only register he had. She went through the report in sequence, then in reverse, then came back to 3 specific points. The signal ping on the civilian channel rather than the military emergency line. He'd used the civilian line because the situation was a civilian emergency, not a military one. She wrote that down. The medkit, she wanted to confirm the child had received appropriate care. He confirmed it, and whether anyone from external press had approached him at any point before or after the escort's arrival, no one had. At the end of it, she set down her notes and looked at him. You understand, she said, that you spent the night in an unsanctioned shelter location with the first princess of Varath Kessin. I spent the night sheltering from rain in a ruin with a lost child, he said. I didn't know the second part until morning. The distinction matters, she said, but not in the way you might think. She made a note. The garrison has received a formal communication from the Varathi Palace Secretariat. It's being processed. He waited. It commends your conduct, she said, specifically by name. He sat with that. That's very kind of them, he said. It also includes a formal request that the garrison consider your continued posting in the outer district. She looked at him steadily. You've been here 18 months. Yes, he said. The standard rotation is 18 months. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a moment. The bridge inspection, she said. The reason you were still in the outer district at nightfall. The detour. The bridge was flagged unsound, he said. I've had it on my route reports for 2 days. Yes, she said. The bridge report has been escalated. It's now a replacement rather than a patch repair. She looked at him. Your 14 route reports have been provided to the District Reconstruction Authority at the Palace Secretariat's request. He thought about the 14 route reports. He'd submitted them over 18 months, one at a time, into the standard garrison route report system, which he was reasonably certain was read only when something prompted it. He'd submitted them because the information was accurate and should be recorded, not because he'd expected them to move anything. "That's good," he said. "There are a few items on those reports that have been in the deferred category for longer than seems right." "Apparently the Secretariat agrees with you," Merritt said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she stood. "That's all, Corporal. Get some sleep. You have a decision to make about the extension." He went back to his billet and slept for 9 hours, which he felt he'd earned. He thought, before he slept, about the child on the floor of the ruin, with the thermal layer folded into a precise rectangle. About the way she'd held out her hand when she understood what the medkit was for, the decision visible in her face a half-second before the movement happened, the same deliberateness she'd brought to everything all night. About the small contained sound when he'd told the Queen she had a significant appetite, and the way the princess had looked at him afterward with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but occupied the same space. He thought about the Queen on the ruined wall beside him in the early morning light in the outer district, sitting there because she decided to sit there, saying, "Not everyone who has a thing gives it." He thought about what it meant from her specifically, from someone who'd spent 11 hours in a command post holding herself together with discipline, while search teams moved through 16 grid sectors in the rain, who'd come through the arch and gone to her knees in the rubble without any of the formality of her entry intact, just the fact of her daughter, who'd then, an hour later, sat on a broken wall and talked to a corporal she'd never met about what he'd done and why, because she wanted to understand it. He fell asleep, and in the morning the thought was still there, with the quality true things had of being equally true in the light as in the dark. The formal letter arrived 3 weeks later. A palace courier, a human civilian which he suspected was a deliberate choice, delivered it to his billet in the late afternoon. It was on paper, actual paper, the pale composite stock that the Varathi court used for correspondence that was meant to be physical and permanent rather than digital and disposable. The crest at the top was the deep court crest of the Varathi royal house, which every soldier in the outer district knew by sight. It was from the princess. He could tell because the handwriting was precise and somewhat laborious in the way of a child learning the formal script with care, pressing each character fully. The guard at the civil liaison office who'd volunteered to translate it went through 2 expressions he couldn't name before settling on professional neutrality. "It's a formal letter of thanks," the guard said. "Standard court format for a benefactor. The form is correct. She spelled everything right." A pause. "Mostly, there's 1 character in the second paragraph." "What does it say?" The guard cleared his throat. "The formal section says, 'To Corporal Eden Voss of the Human Garrison, in formal gratitude for shelter given in the relay station of the 12th Plaza Outer District on the night of the 3rd storm of autumn.' Then the standard thanks formula, that's the court register, and it's done correctly." He paused again. Then the handwriting changes slightly less formal and it says, "The ration blocks were not good, but you gave them anyway. That is better than good food." He looked at the letter. "She also writes," the guard continued, "that the thermal cloth is in her quarters and that she has not given it back because no one has asked for it, and that if you want it back you may ask, but she would prefer to keep it." Voss looked at the letter for a long time. "She can keep it," he said. "I'm not sure I have I'll write the reply myself." It took him an hour and the guard's help with the formal register, and the finished letter was probably not entirely correct in its character forms, and he sent it anyway. He wrote, "The thermal cloth is yours. You folded it well. Keep it as long as you like. I am glad you were warm." He thought about adding something about the ration blocks, that they weren't designed to taste good only to keep you upright, and that sometimes that was the point, but she'd already understood that. The note she'd written said so. He accepted the extension. It wasn't a complicated decision. He'd been in the outer district long enough to know it at the level of knowing a place rather than a posting. The specific quality of the light in the morning on the composite surfaces, the particular repair rhythms of the crews he'd been walking past for 18 months, the bridges and the plazas, and the deferred items on the infrastructure lists that he'd been flagging and watching and flagging again. Leaving felt like leaving something unfinished, and he was not, generally, the kind of person who left things unfinished. He submitted the extension paperwork and went back to the route. He was at the northern checkpoint 6 weeks after the letter when the palace convoy came through on the regular district transit route. All vehicles slowed at the checkpoint. That was the rule. The convoy slowed, was logged by the checkpoint officer, was waved through. Voss was on secondary post, 15 feet back, not actively processing the route, watching the outer plaza where a repair crew was breaking down their equipment at the end of the day's shift, packing their tools back into the district maintenance sleds with the practiced economy of people who'd been doing the same work for weeks and had found the fastest way to do each part of it. The primary transport's passenger window was tinted, standard palace security protocol. He couldn't see inside. The window came down 2 inches. A small ash-gray hand appeared in the gap. It opened and closed once, deliberate, quick, precise, and then withdrew, and the window went back up, and the convoy moved on through the checkpoint and onto the elevated route toward the palace quarter. He stood at secondary post and watched it go until it was out of sight. He didn't wave back. By the time he understood what had happened, the transport was already through and moving, and the moment for a wave had passed. He stood at secondary post and thought about the timing of it, the window coming down at exactly the point where she would have had the clearest sightline to his position, not at the checkpoint itself, where she'd have been looking at the checkpoint officer, but at the 15-foot secondary position where she'd apparently already located him. The window down at exactly the right second, the hand out for exactly the right duration. She'd planned it, or she'd seen him and moved without planning, which in someone with her quality of deliberateness was maybe the same thing, the decision made before you'd consciously arrived at it, because the rightness of the thing was already evident. He thought about the queen on the ruined wall, asterisk not everyone who has a thing gives it. He thought they are very alike in that, the noticing, the decision to show what you've noticed to the person it concerns. He sat in the checkpoint rest room after the shift with cold garrison tea, the kind that tasted like the ration blocks and served the same function, and he thought about the outer district and what it was becoming. The bridge in replacement rather than patch. The relay station at 12th Plaza moved to immediate inspection. 3 of his route reports with formal responses from the District Reconstruction Authority, the first formal responses in 18 months of submission. The deferred list had 59 items when he'd started filing. 33 of them had been addressed or scheduled in the past 2 months. 26 to go. Item 42 in the Eastern Colonnade was on next week's cruise schedule. Things moved slowly here. They moved, though. He drank his cold tea and thought about that, and found the same mild, sustained satisfaction he'd been finding in it all week, which did not feel different from the satisfaction he'd found in it before, but which had perhaps acquired a clearer sense of its own shape. The Queen came to the outer district twice more in the following month, documented as administrative reviews of the post-storm reconstruction progress. Both visits included requests for briefings from garrison personnel, with direct knowledge of outer district conditions during and after the storm period. Voss was on the second briefing list. The briefing was held in a temporary room at the Civil Liaison Office, him on one side of a low table, the Queen and 2 administrative staff, and a translator on the other. The room was plain and functional and smelled of the same passive antimicrobial, as every Varathi public building in the outer district. She asked clear, specific questions about the bridge inspection process, the signal infrastructure gaps in the relay station network, the patrol protocols for single-man routes in adverse weather conditions, and the current status of deferred maintenance items in the outer district's northern quadrant. He answered all of them. The administrative staff wrote. The translator kept up. At the end of the formal questions, she spoke to the translator, who delivered the message with the careful expression Voss had started to recognize as the one that appeared when the communication crossed a protocol boundary. Her Majesty asks whether the garrison has a formal recommendation process for infrastructure concerns that arise during patrol activity. Route report system, he said. We flag issues. They go to the District Infrastructure Bureau. Her Majesty asks whether you have used it. I've submitted 14 reports in 18 months. I can pull the records. The translator conveyed this, a pause. Her Majesty says she is aware of the 14 reports. She has reviewed them. The translator paused again. She says that she considers the patrol coverage of the outer district to have been an undervalued resource, and that she intends to recommend a formal review of how route reports from garrison patrols are incorporated into the district reconstruction prioritization. He looked at the Queen. She was looking at him with the same quality of complete attention he'd seen in the ruined relay station in the early morning after the storm. The reports are accurate, he said. They're just observations. The outer district has a lot of things that need attention. She spoke directly to him, not to the translator in trade common. Yes, but observing accurately is not common. And reporting what you observe when no one will read it is less common still. He didn't have an immediate answer to that. Why did you submit them, she said, when you believed no one was reading? He thought about it. Because they were accurate, he said. The condition of the bridge, the relay station signal gaps, the state of the northern road surfaces, those things are true whether or not anyone reads the report. The report is just where you put the truth so it has somewhere to be. She was quiet for a moment. So it has somewhere to be, she said, not a question. Yes, he said. She looked at the table between them. Then at the window, the outer district visible beyond it, the plazas and the repair crews and the slow, patient work of reconstruction. Then back at him. The princess, she said, has asked about you 3 times now. He wasn't sure what to do with that. She's very observant, he said. She notices things. Yes, she said. She is her father's daughter in that he noticed everything. The past tense registered. He let it pass without comment, which seemed like the right thing to do. She has the thermal cloth on her reading chair, she said. She says it is very practical. It is, he said. That's what it's for. The Queen made the short sound that he'd come to know as a laugh, and the meeting moved to its close, and afterward he walked back to the patrol route and filed his next report. The posting extension formal documentation came through 6 weeks after the briefing. It came with a note from Colonel Merritt. Your 14 route reports have been incorporated into the district reconstruction priority schedule. The bridge replacement is underway. The relay station network signal gap report has been flagged for immediate action. The Northern Road Surface Assessment has been assigned to the Infrastructure Bureau as a priority survey. Merritt. Below that, well done, Corporal. And below that, on the same sheet, in the handwriting he could now recognize without the guard's help, formal Varathi, a single line. He took a photograph of it and sent it to the civil liaison office guard, who had by this point accepted his role as an informal translation service. The reply came back within the hour. It says, some repairs take time. The ones done right are worth waiting for. That's the formal register, but the phrasing at the end is a little unusual for formal Varathi. It reads more like something she said herself than a court formula. He folded the page and put it in his kit, alongside the princess's letter. Then he went back to the outer district and walked the route and filed the next report. One item, item 42 on the deferred list, a structural support in the eastern colonnade that had been logged 3 months ago and not yet addressed. Item 42, 17 to go. He noted the condition accurately, estimated the repair timeline based on what he'd seen from similar work, and submitted it into the system where the truth now had somewhere to go. The outer district went on around him, patient and slow and building, one thing at a time. He walked on,